Hello everyone, we're still talking about the development of eye. In this section, we'll talk about the other parts of the eyeball. These include the iris and cornea, the anterior and the posterior chambers, and the vitreous body, and finally the clinical correlations. We'll talk about the development of all these parts. We'll see what are the developmental sources and how the development actually takes place, and finally we'll move on to the clinical correlations. So let's talk about the development of iris first. So referring to the figure, this in green is the area of iris. This is the pupil, the central hole in the iris. Iris lies anteriorly to the lens. So let's see how the development of iris takes place. It develops from the rim of the optic cup. So this is the optic cup. This is the optic cup. So iris develops from the rim of the optic cup and it grows inward and partially covers the lens. So if this is the rim of the optic cup, iris grows from its boundary and it tends to grow inward towards the center of the optic cup. However, in the it tries to cover the lens. However, there remains a small aperture in the center, and this aperture is known as the pupil. So it is continuous posteriorly with the double layer epithelium of the ciliary body. Here you can see it is continuous posteriorly with the ciliary body. This in pink is the ciliary body and this in green is the iris, and it is continuous with the ciliary body. The neuroectodermal cells of the optic cup gives rise to muscles of the iris, which are the sphincter and the dilator pupillae. So they are formed by the neuroectodermal cells of the optic cup. Now, we're still talking about the development of iris. Now, this is the ciliary body, this is the iris, this is the small central aperture of the iris known as the pupil, this is the lens. Now, there are two layers of the epithelium of iris which constitute the iridial part of the retina. Now, the two layers of the epithelium of iris, they form the iridial part of the retina, the iris part, the part of the retina. Now, the vascular connective tissue of the iris is derived from mesoderm, which is located anterior to the optic cup. So, the mesoderm in the region, it contributes to the vascular connective tissue. There's anterior extension from the rim of the optic cup that does not extend up to the center. Here you can see this is the anterior extension. Almost circular gap remains in the center of the iris. This is the circular gap. This is known as the pupil. Now, color of the iris. It is due to the concentration distribution of the chromatophores in the iris. So, melanin is distributed in stroma of the iris. Now, the eyes appear brown. Here you can see this is the iris and this is the pupil. Now, melanin pigment, if confined to the pigment epithelium on the posterior surface of the iris, the eye may appear blue. Now, let's talk about the development of cornea. So, development of cornea is induced by the lens vesicle. So, here you can see this is the lens vesicle. This lens vesicle, this is the lens, and the lens vesicle induces the formation of the cornea. Lens, there is small aperture in the lens which is known as the pupil. This is the iris, a small aperture in the iris known as the pupil. This is the anterior chamber, and finally the cornea. So, cornea consists of an outer squamous epithelium which is derived from the surface ectoderm. Then we have a lamina propria which is derived from mesoderm and is continuous with the sclera. Then we have internal corneal epithelium which is derived from the neural crest cells. Now, let's talk about the anterior and the posterior chambers of the eye. In the figure here, you can see this is the anterior chamber. So, anterior chamber, this region is the anterior chamber between the cornea and the pupil. And this is the posterior chamber. Here you can see between the lens and the pupil. So, let's see what anterior and posterior chambers are. So, the mesoderm between the developing iris and cornea splits to form the anterior chamber. So the mesoderm which lies between the pupil and the cornea, this in green is the cornea, this blue layer is the iris, and the space between this blue layer is the pupil. So the mesoderm which lies in this region where my mouse cursor is, it forms the anterior chamber. Now the mesoderm located between developing iris, this region, and the cornea. So this is the cornea. It splits to form the posterior chamber. Now the pupillary membrane disappears, so the pupil forms a communication between the anterior and the posterior chamber. So now when the pupillary membrane disappears, it forms a communication between the anterior and the posterior chambers. So aqueous humor is drained by the sinus venosus of sclerae. So at this site, the aqueous humor is being drained. Now let's talk about the vitreous body or the vitreous humor. So vascular mass of transparent gel-like intracellular substance. So in this region lies the vitreous humor. It is a vascular mass or a jelly-like structure that is present inside the eye. Now vitreous humor, it is primarily formed by the neural crest mesoderm, which is present in the optic cup. So the neural crest mesoderm contributes to the formation of the vitreous body. It is secondarily derived from the inner layer of the optic cup and the lens vesicle as well. So now recapping all of this, we have a table which summarizes the development. Now the neuroectoderm of the forebrain, it gives rise to the optic cup. This optic cup forms the retina, the dilator pupillae, the sphincter pupillae, the epithelium of the iris, and the ciliary body. Then it also gives rise to the optic stalk. The optic stalk forms the optic nerve. Then the surface ectoderm. The surface ectoderm, it forms the lens and the anterior epithelium of the cornea. Then we have the mesoderm. The mesoderm forms sclera, the substantia propria, and the posterior epithelium of the cornea. Then we have the choroid, the ciliary body, and the stroma of iris. Then we have the vitreous body, the central artery and vein of retina, and the extraocular muscles. A very comprehensive and a very important table that you must memorize so that you might remember the development of eye. Now moving on to the clinical correlates, we can have anophthalmia, which is absence of eye. The optic vesicle may fail to form. Then we can have microphthalmia. Micro means small, so we can have small eye. The optic vesicle is small or underdeveloped. It may be caused due to intrauterine infections. Then we can have cyclopia or single eye, which is a single median eye. So this is cyclopia or single median eye, not compatible with life. So then we can have persistent pupillary membrane. Here you can see this is a persistent pupillary membrane. So pupillary membrane persists as a whole or as strands of connective tissue. Here you can see these are the strands of connective tissue as well. So it may persist. Then we can have a coloboma of iris. What is coloboma of iris? The congenital notch or cleft on the inferior aspect of iris. Here you can see there is notching of the inferior aspect. It is failure of the choroidal fissure to close. So the choroidal fissure that closes usually in 7th week of intrauterine life, it fails to close. And we can then have congenital aniridia. It occurs from an arrest of development at the rim of the optic cup. So at the rim of the optic cup, there is arrest of development, so we do not have an iris. So moving on, we can have congenital glaucoma. So congenital glaucoma is increased intraocular pressure due to impaired drainage of the aqueous humor. So there's increased ICP due to impaired drainage of aqueous humor. And then we can have congenital aphakia. It occurs if the lens placode fails to develop following failure of lens induction by the optic vesicle. That is, the lens has not been formed. So this was all about this section. In this section, we talked a lot about the development of various structures of the eye and finally the clinical correlates. It is an important section with a very well made table that I would like you to understand and memorize. For further sections, keep watching sqadia.com.